Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch, and I'm going to briefly do a few logistical things, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy. So, a reminder, an even more abbreviated reminder about behavior. I will paraphrase Patrick Swayze from Roadhouse, be nice, you know, and if you're not nice, then we'll have to not be nice, etc. But just play ball. The other thing I was going to say was just a reminder, and I'll remind you about this again, but after the 3 o'clock panel, we'll be having a reception in here with some drinks and light snacks, so if you can, please stick around. And the run of show is the same. Jeremy will talk to the panelists for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to questions from you all. And let me just briefly hand it over to Jeremy, but let me introduce him. Jeremi Suri is the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor both in the LBJ School of Public Affairs and in our College of Liberal Arts in the History Department, author of many fine books and he's also a frequent contributor to mainstream media publications on issues of democracy, global affairs, civil rights, and more. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for being here. I've been looking forward to this discussion all week. I think we're going to really get into some interesting stuff here, and I'm delighted and honored to be here as moderator and maybe sometime peanut gallery for this discussion. We have to my left my friend and colleague and boss, I guess, Ann Stevens. She is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and to my, let's give her a round of applause. And to my right is Pano Kanelos, a new friend. He is the president of the University of Austin. And so we have two incredibly well-informed, experienced, distinguished people to talk about our proposition. Our question today is the traditional university broken beyond repair? That's the question we're going to be discussing. And I thought, Panos, I'd start with you, and I'll ask then the same question of Anne. What is a university supposed to do? Why do we have universities? Before we talk about if they're broken or not, we should have a sense of what the mission is. What does it look like if a university is repaired, is working? What does that look like, Panos?
Thank you. I think that's exactly where we should start. But I do want to say that it's not entirely fair that our moderator is moderating a panel with his boss on the other side of his question. So I feel at a competitive disadvantage already, but I'll try to overcome. As you might imagine, somebody who's involved with a project to start a new university thinks a lot about the purpose of universities, about the telos of universities, why we have these really sort of strange institutions. And so, you know, I think I would start with a simple formulation, and that is that universities exist for the discovery of knowledge, the transmission of knowledge, and the preservation of knowledge. That's the core mission of a university. Universities are the places where society does its thinking. And we set them aside in a very special way. We mostly wall them off from the community at large, and we populate them with these strange creatures called professors. And we give these professors, and I've spent most of my career as a professor, so I mean this sincerely, we give them a privilege. And that privilege is that they get to spend their days reading and thinking and talking and teaching. And then we pass through these institutions, these other beings called students, most of whom will just spend a bit of their life on campuses. Some come back to teach, like I did and we all did, with the idea that what's happening at the university, the pursuit of knowledge, is itself a good, but that also by exposing young people during a formative time in their life to the pursuit of knowledge, that is a good, maybe even a greater good. I'll say briefly that, you know, universities have always been dedicated to preparing graduates for the knowledge economy. And it sounds like a very modern term, but I mean, even if you go back to the medieval roots of universities in Europe, they were essentially just very limited courses of study. And they were all courses that were essentially fields whose work was primarily intellectual in nature. You could either be a lawyer, a doctor, or a theologian. By the way, those are the choices my mom gave me too. And that was sort of it. That's what the knowledge economy entailed. The rest of the world operated outside of primarily the life of the mind and not by other principles. As the knowledge economy expanded over time, the role of universities expanded and changed. And I think that's something that we're sort of grappling with today. What is the role of universities in the culture that we live in today? So I'll stop there.
Great. Anne, your thoughts?
So one of my, as I thought about this event, I won't say it was actually a recurring bad dream, but it was like we have this event on Discord and we get up here and I say, oh yeah, I completely agree, which I actually do, but of course I'm an academic, so I'll add to that. I think the first thing that came to mind when I looked at the title and even as Jeremy was introducing is that I'm not sure we should talk about the traditional university, because one of my observations with a lot of the heat and discussion of universities in America is there are a lot of different things we mean when we talk about higher education. There are elite privates, there are elite publics, flagships such as UT, there are small liberal arts colleges, there are less selective small colleges, and then there are vast numbers of community and junior colleges. And so these institutions have slightly different purposes. I will say, I've lived my professional life mainly in large public research universities, and I agree that the mission is to discover, transmit, and preserve knowledge. I think I've always felt that as a public institution, it's particularly important because we are using public dollars, we have to protect and defend the public trust, that we have to really integrate those missions. So it's not just 3 things we can check off and have in separate spheres, but we need to make sure as a research institution, and this is, I think, getting to the heart of a lot of what we want to talk about today, we need to engage students and have them understand not just the knowledge that comes out of our great faculty, but the process of getting to that knowledge. Because that's really where the magic is. That's where we think about the life of the mind. One of the advantages to a research institution or a place where faculty are actively engaged in research is that students don't just learn the facts, but they can see the process and they can see hard problems and how they're solved. And sometimes that's not always friendly in the sense that our faculty, with their own discipline within their department, go through enormous academic arguments and fights and scrutiny. And I think we don't talk about that enough. We're trying to expose students to it, but we definitely don't expose the general public to that. And so I think a lot about how to integrate those missions, and I think that's really, the more you can do that, I would argue the more effective you are at making all 3 of them happen.
Great. These were terrific answers to start with, and they gave us agreement, and so now I'm going to provoke disagreement here. And I'm going to start with you, Anne, and then go to Panos. As I've taken notes on your comments, universities are about knowledge. They're about engaging students. They're about the process of learning to learn. And then they're about integrating these elements and engaging the public as well as our students. That's my summary of your comments. Anne, how are you doing? How are you as a leader at the university doing in achieving those missions?
I think, it's hard to grade oneself. Let me say that at UT and our college, are we perfect? No. But I think we are headed in the right direction. And why do I say that? Because in my spare time, I'm a labor economist. So I do think we talked a little about the life of the mind and preparing for some vocations, but I think a lot, and again, I find this very tied to the public nature of this institution. It is important that we engage students in the life of the mind, but also that we prepare them for the world out there. And I am all for being lofty and having big goals, but students also have to be able to support themselves and their families, and they have to get a return on the tuition dollars they've spent. And so when I say I think many parts of higher ed are actually doing quite well, it is because if you look at the numbers, the value proposition for strong universities that work hard to keep graduation rates high, which is really critical, the return on that investment is kind of extraordinary. And you know, since I was in graduate school, labor economists have been worrying about the returns to education, partly because of the increase in inequality, college-educated people pulling away from less college-educated. But then we go through periods where we think, oh, but we're trying to get so many more people to go to college, we're going to drive down the return. It won't be worth it anymore. We're nowhere close to that. So I think in that way, we're doing well. Could we do better? Absolutely. I tend not to see a lot of space between exposing students to the life of the mind, engaging them in the discovery of knowledge, and having them do well in the labor market. Because I think of what we do as a little bit like athletic cross-training. When you came to Texas, you knew it was going to come to football. When the football coach has his players running around the field and banging into dummies and jumping through little cones, that's not because that's what they're going to be expected to do on Saturday. It's training. It's training their muscles and their memories to be able to do some skills and build those muscles. I think in liberal arts in many fields, we're doing that. When we have students do close reading in the humanities, it's so they can appreciate art and literature, but it's also so that, 20 years down the road when they're in some corporate setting and they're trying to decipher what the competition is doing through these badly written documents, they have some muscle memory. They're like, oh, I've read obscure texts before, and I'm going to be able to do that. And that's just one kind of silly example. But on that, I'd say we're doing well. I could go on and on, but I sense impatience, justified.
No.
So I'll say more. There are other ways where I think maybe we're not doing as well, but I'm going to defer that.
So I really appreciate that answer. I mean, what it comes down to, it seems for you as one of your main propositions, Anne, is the return on investment. That what the tuition dollars cost is exceeded with the value that the students take away when they leave. Panos, why do you have a different point of view? What leads you to think that value proposition and the general argument Anne has made is wrong?
I have to argue with a labor economist about ROI. I mean, this is, again, this is stacked against me. Look, I don't think it's wrong. Maybe I want to add some nuance to it. Yeah. Maybe say something that might be a little provocative. Why not?
Please.
So Anne mentioned earlier, and I completely agree, that there are different types of universities with serving different types of students towards different ends. So to talk about the university or the traditional university is to elide some significant differences. So I want to lay out what I consider maybe three types of university with three different ends, and then think about the ROI relative to each. I think when we're talking about elite universities, maybe hyper-elite universities, top 20, 30, 40, wherever you draw that line. I won't ask what UT's ranked. I was going to make sure UT's in there, wherever UT and above. Then we're talking about hyper-elite universities. Actually, this doesn't apply to UT, so I retract that because I put UT in the other band. The hyper-elite universities, the ROI is not income, it's power. The function of hyper-elite universities is to provide pathways to power for students. It's elite formation. Elite universities are about elite formation. And so, really when you go to an Ivy or that, you're not, your primary concern, at least I'm talking generally speaking, I mean, this doesn't apply to every student and that, but primary concern isn't, how much money I'm going to make, but which Supreme Court justice am I going to clerk for, right? Or who, where are my connections in that? Because you realize the end game is something more than just financial ROI, even though that's folded into it. I would say the next band of universities, and maybe it's the next 100, 200, I don't know where to draw the line. The end goal is not power, but prosperity. And I think that's where the kind of financial ROI plays out, that you have an opportunity to go to a school and become distinguished in a particular field, learn things. And so it becomes very important what you do there. It doesn't really matter what you major in an Ivy League school. It doesn't matter. It matters at most of the schools that you major in because it's putting you on a particular pathway. And it matters that you get an internship, not that you clerk with a justice, but you get an internship because you're building a kind of a portfolio of your future so you can be prosperous to some degree or another, and however you define that. And I would say the vast majority of schools, of the 4,000 plus that are in the US, are oriented towards upward mobility, right? Just a step up the ladder from where you came from, and maybe towards prosperity in that. I think thinking about the ROI in different contexts is important. So it's not just a simple calculation of I put X a number of tuition dollars in, and then I get over the time some sort of revenue or income over a period of time, but what the end game is. And I could say more about especially the ultra-elite schools and that ROI, but I'll stop there.
Well, and I want to follow up on that, and I want to follow up sympathetically. I know you've been claiming that things are stacked against you, but they're not. I'm stacked against both of you. When we talk about the purpose of a university and we talk about return on investment, is it appropriate to focus on ROI, or is it more appropriate to focus on perhaps a broader metric, which would include sometimes ROI, which would be the quality of one's life? I am a product of elite institutions, and yes, I was going there as the child of immigrants for the purposes of prosperity. But what actually I got from elite institutions, which no one in my family, other than my own children, can understand, is a love of learning, a different quality of life, a life of contemplation, a life of the mind. And I'm quite certain that's what we're offering at UT, or I hope that's what we're offering at UT. What leads you to think that the University of Austin can do this better? Because I've heard you talk about this, that is the proposition you're offering, that they will have a better life of the mind with you. What's going to make it better?
Well, rather than better, I'll just say why I think we'll do it well, or strive for a kind of excellence.
Okay.
Yeah, look, I think the purpose of education is not professional success in the end, it's human flourishing. Human flourishing includes professional success to some extent, but it isn't defined by it. And so we are institutions that have to promote flourishing. And so the real ROI measure should be something like a human flourishing index.
Yeah.
And I think if we had something like that, we'd get a sense of the true value of what an education is. Why do I think we'll do that well at University of Austin? First of all, because we care about that. Front and center. I said this last night for those of you who are here. I think human beings are primarily truth-seeking creatures. We are Homo sapiens. We're the creatures that seek wisdom. And to flourish, we have to have pathways to learn and to learn about the world. And what's highest in higher education, the reason we call it higher education, is that through these distinctive institutions, we allow human beings to soar to the highest possible intellectual heights, or at least give them the potential to do so. It's not the only place. I mean, look, you could be a very well-educated person with a stack of books sitting in a cave, but these institutions are dedicated to this. And so just beginning with that, when you assess your success as an institution, if you put human flourishing as the assessment tool, it creates a particular kind of institution.
Can I respond? Yeah. I think I would only make a small correction to say I didn't mean to imply that the narrow ROI was the main purpose of what we do here. I think this life of the mind and flourishing is especially important, again, especially at large public institutions, because if we don't embrace that, and if we're not conscious of that, it's such an incredible missed opportunity, because the scale and the potential we have, as Pano was indicating, to think about and affect social mobility, it can't just be social mobility into this number of technical occupations. It has to also be a form of social mobility that equalizes the knowledge and the appreciation of beauty and life and complexity. That is what the humanities teach, social sciences teach. And so I think I would probably draw a less stark line between one providing, one set of institutions promoting power and connections and maybe a really complex life of the mind, and the next tier, because I think here at a place like UT, I think we have not just the ability, but an obligation to do both. And I think we do both. We get a lot of, I think, poorly informed attacks on the numerical ROI, so I always like to talk about it. But I think all of it's happening here.
So Anne, if I could follow up on that, one of the criticisms that's often voiced, that certainly you and I have heard, that Pano has heard, and maybe one of the many reasons why the University of Austin has come into existence, it seems to me, is some students and some parents of some students and some people who don't have students but yet feel the need to comment on universities, they argue sincerely that some students are not flourishing in our universities. And they claim that there is a bias against particular points of view, maybe also a bias against those who are more religiously inclined. We can discuss this in many ways. It's a very serious argument. It's a very sincere argument. It's a very important argument. And I think it's one of the reasons the University of Austin exists. So what is your response to those criticisms?
Yeah, thanks. I think a lot about this. We all do. I think a couple of key points. One is that I do think there is a crisis in, this is why we're all here today, in people being able to express views, controversial or less controversial, and argue with one another in a constructive way. That is a crisis, I would argue, perhaps of universities, but of society at large as well. I think we have to, when we start to look and say, is it a particular problem at universities? I'm not sure I'm on board with that, because we are complex. So in the College of Liberal Arts, we've got 700 faculty, about 12,000 students, and the mathematicians in the group can figure out the number of possible combinations of human interactions that involves on any given day. And I think we hear absolutely anecdotes and documented cases where things didn't go right, and some viewpoint was not warmly received or was shut down, and we should all be fighting against that. But a lot that goes on, if you think of a university as this globe, there's a lot going on in that interior that no one hears about. And so just as an example, we track, what is our reputation for free expression? How well are we doing? So in a typical semester in my college, I'll get at the end of the semester course evaluations. And the last one I looked at was for 61,000 student course interactions, where one of the questions they're asked is, did the professor in your classroom allow and facilitate free expression and exchange of ideas? So I look at those results. Out of these 61,000 reports, I think it's 87% agree or strongly agree that happened in the classroom. About 4% say it didn't, and then the rest are neutral. Now, we don't have to take student reports of this as saying, oh, we're fine, we don't have a problem, 87% say yeah. But I think it is really important to know that we are monitoring this, and even if we have some failures, it doesn't mean we're not trying and succeeding most of the time. Probably the more important thing, when I first realized we were asking this question semester after semester, The more important finding is that you can then look, I can go and see, okay, in what departments are more than 4%, more than the average saying they don't feel like there's free expression? And it's all over the board. And here, I don't know if there are any of my colleagues from economics. Oh yeah, I see one. The course that gets the worst score on that, and I'm gonna have an excuse, is economics. And I mean, then go and look at student comments, and you can kind of see, look, as economists, we have a pretty rigid framework for how we do analysis. We reason from assumptions, we test those assumptions, or we don't, but everything we conclude is based on them. It's not as if, I mean, you can figure out, people think anthropology is very liberal, economics or government are maybe more conservative. It's not a liberal-conservative split. You know, the highest ranking, I think economics, 7% of students worry about this. And then when you look at their comments, they're not saying, oh, the professor wouldn't let me disagree with him or her. It's other stuff. Now, there's still an issue, and in particular, students, and we've had forums on this with students where we say, how can we help you be more comfortable disagreeing, expressing difficult ideas? And the thing they say is like, we're not sure what you can do. We're worried about what other students are hearing and reporting. And so sometimes I'm careful what I say because I don't want a classmate to report it. And there, I actually think University of Austin has some interesting ideas on how to build a culture to address that concern that's kind of student to student. But I think, I mean, we have to keep working on this, and it's part of our obligation to students to help them understand how to have these difficult, contentious conversations in a productive way and move forward.
Yeah. So Pano, building on that, I want to turn to you, and I've heard many of your very eloquent and thoughtful statements about what the University of Austin is about, and this is an issue where I think you and I agree a lot, right? I think you and I are both sort of absolutists on free speech. I think Ann is too. I think the First Amendment is the cornerstone of our democracy. It's one of the things that defines our democracy. And you've made the eloquent case that universities are not fine in the way different points of view are handled. You're careful as to where to place responsibility, and I'm not really sure what you think about that, but it does seem to me that you believe that the situation's more dire than Ann just described it. Can you explain your position on that to us?
I'll try to. I mean, I think what I'm going to say is probably something that most of us find to be intuitively right. You know, it's the myth of the devious Marxist professor like rubbing his hands together, waiting to corrupt the minds of youths. You know, is it's a myth. You know, I don't think that's true. I don't think there are all these far left, Marxist professors who are just waiting to corrupt young people. Maybe one here or there, but that's not the primary problem. I think Ann touched upon the larger problem, and that is that we exist in a world, universities exist in a world where expressing one's opinion comes with risk, primarily because everything is available to everybody all the time on the internet, and it never goes away. We were talking earlier over lunch, and I said, in my mind, if you think about what social media is, I use a kind of Freudian analogy. And again, I'm not a Freudian. I don't even play one on TV. But the concept of, having the id, that part of us, it's kind of like the lizard brain that wants what it wants and will say what it wants to say on one end. And on the other end, the superego, those things that society and civilization tells us that we should or shouldn't do to temper our behavior with us, the ego in the middle. Social media has completely disrupted that. Social media is the culture's id, and there's nothing to put it back in the box, right? Because people can say things, make comments, do things on social media without any sense that they will ever be held accountable or even acknowledged for what they say. And so the genie's, the genie's been let out of the bottle, and so we live in this world now where we are constantly absorbing, the unfiltered reptilian part of our fellow human beings. And young people are affected by this much more than we are, because this has always been their world. And now they enter into these spaces called classrooms. And everybody they see, they have to sort of think, they have a kind of a dual understanding of this person. There's the person who sits across the table from me, who seems nice and humane, maybe even cute, all right, and I like them. But there's that version of them that exists in the ether, that social media, that may take something I said and cause me harm. And so it is a very difficult environment in which to have free and open conversations. Universities have a particular responsibility to push back the influence of the greater culture and that kind of miasma of social media influence, and create spaces where conversation can flourish. And we're not doing a good enough job of that. And so one of the things you can do when you're creating a new university is build the culture from the ground up and put in place practices, habits, ways of being together that will allow conversation to flourish. Conversation's beneficial and educational as best you can. And I'll give one example. We intend at University of Austin to abide by the Chatham House rule. All right, if any of you have ever been at conferences or symposia, you'll know sometimes the Chatham House rule will be put in place, which essentially just says whatever is said within the confines of a conversation around the table in a particular setting, anybody can say whatever they want. Nobody can repeat with attribution what's said outside of that setting. And if you do, there are consequences. So at the university, we say, look, we'll get together, we'll sit around the table, you can share your ideas. You can say things sometimes that are stupid, you can make mistakes. Maybe we offend one another. We'll also teach students how to be gracious to one another and forgiving. But you are honor bound not to cause any one of your peers or the professor harm by repeating what they say in the classroom, outside the classroom, unless you get their permission. And if you do that, then there are consequences. So things like that, I think, can help push back, but we have to be very purposeful about creating an environment in which students and professors can be intellectually risky.
You have a lot of faith in people following that honor code. I have spent years, as you have, as Ann has, going to conferences where people invoke the Chatham House rule and then all talk about what everyone has said thereafter. And I've been on numerous committees where that's happened. But the follow-up question I wanted to ask you is about selection bias, right? It strikes me that one of the challenges we face in creating real, vibrant conversations with people from different points of view is people select into the conversations they want to be in. One of the other effects of social media is it allows us to find the 10 people in the world who think exactly like we think and just communicate with them and get news just from them. How is the University of Austin going to prevent itself from recreating that problem? What I see at UT, what I saw at Yale, what I see at University of Wisconsin and other places I've been, is certain people with certain viewpoints go into particular majors and go into particular programs. For example, my son is in the directed studies program, the Great Books program at Yale, which is supposed to foster broad discussion. There tend to be a larger number of conservative students who flock to that program, and less conservative students who take different programs as freshmen, right? So people select in. And what I've anecdotally noticed, and you're gonna, I'm sure, be able to correct my statistics on this, what I've anecdotally noticed is that the people who seem most excited about the University of Austin seem to have one particular point of view, and the people who seem most threatened by it, feel most threatened by it, have another point of view. And my concern that I'd love to hear you address following on your answer from before is how are you going to bring together different points of view at the University of Austin rather than what seems more likely to me, which might be a recreation of what already exists, which is that you get a particular kind of point of view and a particular kind of student, and the University of Texas gets another particular kind of student, and Rice gets another particular kind of student. How are you going to get beyond the selection bias?
It's a great question. I think one that we take very seriously. Look, first of all, you have to be, again, purposeful in the way you construct your institution. If one of the problems in higher education, and I would identify this as a problem, is that most universities tilt too far, or they're too politically asymmetrical, tilt too far to one end of the political spectrum. That creates a lack of, in many cases, a lack of intellectual complexity. The solution isn't to create an institution at the other end of the political spectrum. The solution is to do away with the spectrum altogether. So the idea that you're trying to achieve some sort of balance between conservative students and liberal students and conservative faculty, and like, I just reject that I just reject that whole framework. The difference isn't between red and blue. It's not between Republican and Democrat. It's not between conservative and liberal. It's between liberal and illiberal. The students and faculty we want to attract are liberal in the root sense of the term. That is, they're interested in liberal education, which is an education that insists upon intellectual pluralism, that insists that you ask questions that make you uncomfortable, that insists that you hear every opinion out and also ask for evidence. So the bias that we're building the institution for is towards people who are seeking a liberal education. And I will tell you right now, there's no political group that has a monopoly on that kind of liberalism.
So, Anne, do you agree with the implication of what Pano just said, which is that there's a problem of illiberalism at UT?
I think at UT, I don't think it's specific to UT, or as I said, even to universities, but I do think that is the challenge, I do think we have an obligation and a need to make sure that if students, whether it's social media, the world, the way our faculty has been hired and evolved, there is this sense that we're not always balanced, or some students don't want to hear other ideas. So I think, what I really agree with him is that you have to be purposeful. You have to think about this. And, we have started, I tried an experiment a year or so ago where just giving faculty some incentives to very directly tell me how they're going to change their course on a whole range of difficult topics so that students will actively disagree, be forced to take positions they don't necessarily come to naturally. And so we heard a summary this morning in a meeting I was at where it's a course on U.S.-Asia relations, international political economy, where the students were doing this debate about a China versus U.S. trade negotiation, and one of the students playing the U.S. side said, "Oh, you know what? We'll get them to make concessions by not worrying about the Taiwan thing because it's not a big deal." Well, the students on the China side were like, wait, hold on here. And I mean, the professor, because we had asked her to go through a process where you're actively trying to get students to engage in this kind of thinking about how they think, she had a great description of how they worked through that. And we have to do more of that. And I was sort of talking about our great scale and all the potential. The flip side of that is I've done this experiment now in 7 courses. Well, that leaves me about 12,000 or so. But I think I agree. It is just a time in society where, there are times when, okay, we have to teach students how to use, write their papers and edit them on word processors. That's not the mission of a university, but we're not still having students turn in papers on typewriters. It's no different with these major social challenges. We can still teach the knowledge, all the things we do, but I think we also have an obligation to say there's some big challenges that kind of supersede these about how we discuss with each other, how we get along, how we participate. And I think we can do more, and I hope we'll continue to do that.
Can I just follow up quickly? Because I want to say something that's going to raise eyebrows from people who, well, when they hear what I'm about to say. I'm against intellectual diversity. And let me explain that. Oftentimes people characterize and they contrast the idea that universities are kind of politically monochromatic and you need this thing called intellectual diversity, and that's the cure. When when I hear intellectual diversity, what I hear is, well, if we only had, instead of having 10 people who all look at things the same way, 10 people who all look at things a different way, and that would be great. So I see things this way, I see things that way, I see things that way. We all get together, and there's a net gain. What we really need to be doing is not looking for how I see this and you see this, but for the things we have not yet seen. In other words, we shouldn't come to universities as kind of fully baked people with positions that we hold on to tightly. We have to come with convictions that are loosely held, but still are convictions. So we have to create a culture where it's not, the end isn't just a bunch of people who think about things differently, intellectual diversity, it's about intellectual complexity. Yeah. I think that's the end goal.
I embrace that fully, and I think both Anne and Pano are making a fantastic point here, right? That learning is about questioning what you already believed, not reinforcing what you already believed. So I want to ask a question about illiberalism then of each of you, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience, and then I might sneak in another question at the end. We'll see. But on the topic of illiberalism, oftentimes, illiberalism is seen in the debates about universities as coming from the left. It's often seen as coming from the right in our general discourse, though some see it from the left. But within the criticisms of university, it's usually illiberalism seen as coming from the left. Certain viewpoints that are not on the left allegedly not getting the attention they deserve. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. What about within universities, illiberalism from the right? And I want to ask a very specific question about that. Are the attacks on, and I don't mean intellectual diversity in the way you talked about it, but the attacks on, in your words, Pano, people who see things differently and come from different backgrounds, and the emphasis on bringing people from different backgrounds, are the attacks on that kind of diversity that are quite explicit, are those illiberal?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, look, if what one is striving for, if we go back to the very beginning, that the purpose of universities is the discovery of knowledge. The discovery of knowledge is facilitated by the exchange of competing ideas. And anything that would foreclose a maximalist version of that is, especially if it's doing so intentionally and with an agenda, is illiberal.
So the University of Austin is for racial diversity?
I mean, yeah, I mean, look, we're for intellectual pluralism in all its forms. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, that seems axiomatic.
Okay, great. And how do you see this issue, right? I mean, you deal on a day-to-day basis. You've had to change the names of a whole bunch of offices within COLA. There are programs we've had to cancel. How do you navigate this space?
Yeah. I think we have, we've been through in Texas some changes as a result of some prohibitions on certain, I call them technologies of how we were working to diversify the faculty, the student population. And so, personally, do I agree with every aspect of that law? No. Have I complied and worked to preserve our values and what we think are important and still comply with state law? Yes. I think, I don't know, maybe this is not where you were going, but the thing that worries me more even than what we've been through legislatively is another phase of restrictions have to do with the ideas we can teach and discuss. And the good aspect of the state law that was passed is that there were very clear, powerful carve-outs for academic research, scholarship, and for academic study discussion in the classroom. That is our core. This goes back to the first question. What worries me about an illiberal approach is if we move into curricular content. That really, I believe, threatens the university, because the thing about an idea is that ideas don't have clear boundaries. So you can start out banning some idea, and it's going to have implications you cannot imagine. So if you don't like, say, for example, critical race theory, and you say we can't talk about that, there's a lot of work that looks at, I think all the time, about a really famous economics paper done by a Nobel Prize winner and another outstanding economist, where they were trying to understand how money, investments in school, affect earnings of adults decades later. And they showed, economists like to find clever little ways to get the data variation they need. So they looked at the history of segregated schools in the South and saw that black men of a certain generation who had attended schools that were much weaker resourced, 10, 20, 30 years later, were doing much worse in the labor market, and you could tell by the state-to-state patterns. Look, David Card is not a critical race theorist. He is not particularly, I don't think anyone would accuse him of being liberal, but when I think about some of the attacks on one idea, I don't know how we can say you can't talk about that, but then we can allow people to think creatively about how to learn from the world and do research. And so that's a long digression, I apologize, but it's a chance to talk about an econ paper. I think that's where things get even more concerning, and that's what keeps me up at night.
So in your opinion, not speaking for the institution, but speaking for Dr. Ann Stevens, the attacks on critical race theory and the prohibitions on teaching it are illiberal, yes?
I think attacks on ideas and prohibitions of teaching ideas would be illiberal.
But criticism of ideas is not illiberal,
No,
right?
absolutely.
So, and to recognize, look, I think critical race theory is it's something very important in our society today for people to think about and grapple with without necessarily accepting its implications. I certainly don't think critical race theory or any theory should be the operating system of a university.
Right, sure.
So, but I do think, it's something that should be studied and discussed and argued about, and because it's an important phenomena in the culture today, for sure.
So the University of Austin would hire a critical race theorist as a faculty member? It's a serious idea.
Yeah,
it's
no,
worth
look,
talking about.
what I would say is we're generally against theoretical approaches like that at large for complex reasons. But I say, look, I'm certainly willing to hire somebody who wants to bring texts from critical race theory into the classroom and take them seriously, without a doubt. I think that's fine. And I don't think there's any idea that we should be afraid of, and I don't think there's any idea that should be off the table. I think that's being intellectually honest to say that we need to confront the things that are, let's say, most prevalent in our society today, and figure them out. Figure out what we believe in, what we don't believe in, and why in each case. So, yeah.
I love that answer. Thank you. This has been a great conversation, and we have two people here who are clearly very thoughtful, but also have very difficult jobs. Managing universities is like managing a city. It's a really difficult job. Pano's building a city and has inherited a city, and she's trying to manage it. I want us to close with one sentence from each of them, and then we're going to run off the stage. I want us to close with capturing what makes universities so wonderful. I've spent my entire life. I come from a family of immigrants. I'm the first to go to college and the first to get a PhD in my family. I've never left universities. All right, I love them. I love them. They're the greatest institutions. Or maybe they're the worst, but better than all the rest. So I want to ask Ann and then Pano, just one sentence. What keeps you going? What do you love most about being at a university that drives you to do what you do?
I would say I see every day that there is not a conflict between an exciting life of the mind and growing and supporting social mobility at a very large scale at an institution like this.
Great. Pano?
First of all, I want to say I'm very hopeful about universities. I do think universities are extraordinarily valuable institutions, and largely because at heart they're not about the transfer of information, but about transformation. And the ability of universities to transform the lives of students and all those involved in those communities is, it's something that I felt personally in my life. I was a first-generation college student, son of immigrants. I get to be a college president. Isn't that an amazing thing? And so we need to continue to nurture these opportunities for all those who come within our communities.
Please join me in a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. That was fun. Thank you, everyone.